Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is February 28th, 2019. We're broadcasting to you live from our Mormon Stories studios in Salt Lake City, Utah. And we're really excited, super excited for today's interview. Don Anderson, or as he's known now, Don Casias, worked for the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from 2002 to 2015 as the Senior Vice President of Patron and Partner Services for FamilySearch. So we have titled this episode, An Insider's View of Mormon Genealogy and Temple Work. Don, in his work as a computer guy, had a lot to do with things like name harvesting, name extraction, the usage of temple names in the temple ordinance work. There's a lot of really interesting topics to discuss in today's episode. Just to give you a teaser, the process for name extraction, the challenge of finding enough names to do temple work when you have, theoretically millions of church members doing temple work. How do you find those names? How do you make sure that the quality of those names are good? Sometimes people submit bogus names, etc. We've heard over the years rumors about the church recycling and reusing the same name or the same names up to dozens of times per name. So we'll get the skinny on whether or not that's true, and why, if that's true, why that's been such a problem. Many of you have heard about the controversies around, descendants of Holocaust victims being angry that Holocaust victims, were having their temple work done. Don had some, connection to that work. Of course, there are always many of you who are concerned about having the ability to prevent or block your name or loved ones' names from having temple work done. Then there's always just the Mormon genealogy industry. Lots of questions about that, about the relationship between Ancestry.com and FamilySearch and the church. It's also super interesting. Don had many interactions with apostles and with general authorities in the Quorum of the 70, so he can talk about that. And of course, we want Don to talk about his own story and his own faith journey, which in and of itself would merit its own Mormon Stories episode. So we are super thrilled to have Don with us in studio. We are also very excited to have many of you joining us live on Facebook. We invite you to submit your questions and comments, although we've already culled a few hundred questions and comments from listeners on Reddit, on the ex-Mormon Reddit, but also on my Facebook timeline and on the Mormon Stories podcast Facebook community. We are going to ask as many questions as we can in the time that Don can give us. So as far as just news goes, we're going to skip the announcement section and just jump right into the interview. So, without any further ado, Don Anderson / Casias, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Anything I left out of the introduction in terms of the types of topics we'll be covering?
I think it was great.
Okay. So we're going to do something a little bit different this time. Normally, we spend a lot of time with the interviewee's story, and then we deal with the subject matter. Because there's so much interest in this subject matter, I'm going to reverse the order just a tiny bit. We're going to just touch lightly on your story just to get you up to the point where you started working for the church. We're going to dig deeply into your time at the church, and a lot of these questions that people have. And I know that by then people are going to be gripped about you and who you are and why you're even willing and able to come out and speak now. And so we're going to end with your epic story and sort of end on the strongest note, the most personal note. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
All right. So let's begin, if you don't mind. And by the way, listeners, for those of you on Facebook, we always appreciate if you can like our Mormon Stories Podcast Facebook page or give us a positive review. For those of you who are willing, it'd be awesome if you could share right now this live interview on your Facebook profiles, on Reddit, in Instagram, wherever you do social media, on Twitter, and you could give a little teaser about the types of topics we're going to talk about, because I think people are going to really want to hear about this, this episode. We spend billions and billions of dollars, or the church spends billions and billions of dollars, each year or historically, and all the time and effort that our loved ones spend doing genealogy. It's really important for us to kind of get an insider's view of what they're doing, how much of that is meaningful versus not, how it's functioning, and what it all means. And so for those of you who are willing, please share this episode now on your Facebook page, on your profile, on your timeline. If we could get up to 30 or 40 or 50 shares today, that could really spread the word and help get the word out on what's going on, and provide people with answers for questions that they have around genealogy and temple work. So please do that if you can. So without any further ado, Don, why don't you give us just kind of a high level, a quick, kind of a summary of your early church years that led you to church employment?
Sure. And by the way, it's interesting we're doing the interview this week because it's the week of the largest genealogical conference in the United States here in Salt Lake that the church puts on, called Roots Tech. You've got genealogists from all over the United States, to some extent all over the world, here in Salt Lake this week, meeting to geek out on family history. So
I think I just saw that the church gave a couple $1 million to some organization in affiliation.
African American Museum, I think.
Yeah.
I saw the same announcement. So,
yeah.
But me, to some extent, a kind of typical growing up Mormon story. I was the youngest of 6 kids. Kind of a serious caboose, 8 years between me and my nearest sister. So I joke that I'm kind of a only child with siblings, because for most of my growing up years, I was the only child at home. Interestingly enough, just from a pure kind of maybe stereotypical Mormon perspective, I'm the youngest of 52 grandchildren. My mother was the youngest of 18 children in her family. My grandfather was married and had 6 daughters with his first wife, and then married my grandmother and had 12 children with her. So I'm part of a big Mormon family that goes back a long way, with pioneer ancestors that, came across the trail. I have a great-great-grandfather that's buried on the border of Wyoming and Utah that died crossing the plains. So, but I grew up somewhat in Utah. I lived here until I was 6, then moved to Colorado and lived there until I was 17. My dad worked for the FAA and moved us out there, and then moved back here. And I've lived here in Utah ever since. Other than now, I live in Colorado, but lived here ever since. Other than 3 years that I spent in the UK for work. So that was kind of me. I got married when I was in my early 20s. 2 boys, both grown adults now. So that's I don't know. That's kind of me in a nutshell. I've served in. I served in a bunch of callings throughout time in the young men's. Served as executive secretary or ward clerk. I mean, in the bishopric. But before I moved to the UK, I served as mission leader during the 3 years that I lived in the UK. Then when I came back, a variety of callings again. Gospel doctrine teacher a couple times. I served in the bishopric for a few years as first counselor. And then my career has mostly been in call centers. So I worked for outsourced call center companies. I worked for the same company, kind of as a job to put me through school, and they gave me lots of promotions and lots of opportunities. So I kind of grew with them. And then one day I was driving down the freeway to work. I worked down at 45th South in Salt Lake, and I got a call from a recruiter that said, "Hey, there's an interesting opportunity. The church is looking for somebody. They're trying to grow more worldwide in terms of the help for individuals finding their ancestors with FamilySearch. And FamilySearch is looking for a senior vice president of Patron services." And so, there's few times in your life when you can get your spiritual life to align with your work. And so it was an interesting opportunity. And so I went down, and I joke and say, 4 months later and 17 interviews later, they extended an offer to me. And FamilySearch at the time was in a kind of huge transitionary period of really, I would say, reinventing itself. They'd brought in a new managing director who was from Silicon Valley, super smart guy, incredibly fun to work with.
Are you okay saying his name?
I'm okay with his name, if hopefully he is. But Jay Verkler is his name. Just a super smart guy. Loved working for Jay. One of the brightest, most capable individuals I've ever worked for. Challenged me to grow, challenged the organization, and a kind of a square peg in a round hole for church culture, because he kind of took no prisoners and didn't take no for an answer. And so he was great in terms of working for the church because he was willing to do what it took to help change to happen in an organization that really, really needed change. And so he brought in a bunch of people from the outside. I was one of them. And we set about trying to reinvent family history with an organization that's been around for, since 1890.
So let's back up. What can you tell us about the history of Mormon temple work and name extraction, kind of the stuff that happened before you even got there, and any evolution of the church's genealogy work, the management of data and information systems in the temple that preceded your joining and your boss joining?
Sure.
Just so people can know.
Yeah.
Some of the complexities and difficulties.
So in some ways, family history is kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same. So the problems of family history, I would say, have been the same almost since the beginning. It's a problem of, number one, how many members are actually interested in it. Everyone would like to have their ancestors have their ordinances. So let's back up.
What's the doctrine? Give us, for the non-Mormons that are listening, what's the doctrine that we're trying to satisfy here?
Sure. So, Joseph Smith early on in his teachings basically revealed the doctrine of individuals who have not had the opportunity to have their ordinances, those things that are required to reach salvation.
So
I'll speak in generic terms and then I'll speak in LDS terms, but those things that are necessary for salvation, that those could be completed by their ancestors on their behalf, and then that ancestor could choose to accept it or not. So yes, baptism, confirmation, initiatory, washing, anointing, endowment, sealing, both sealing to parents, sealing to children, sealing to spouse. Those are the temple ordinances. And so that kicked off, those individuals that went down to the river and baptized their ancestors and then had to get them recorded. That kicked off a set of very complex kinds of things. So if you look at the complexities of the activities around family history and temple work, they're basically in the organization and identification. So you've got the complexity of identifying who actually your ancestors are, identifying the John Smith that is your John Smith from the other billion John Smiths that lived. And figuring out which one they are, organizing that information, and then knowing whether or not temple ordinances have already been performed, because we look like a big pyramid in terms of we're at the bottom with lots and lots of people, and at the top is Adam and Eve, and then there's all of us in between. But we share a common ancestry, and so it might be very possible. As a matter of fact, it's probably fairly likely you and I share some ancestor back there. And so how do you organize this so that once I've submitted it and the ordinances have been completed, that someone else doesn't need to do that work again? And how do you organize that work, both in terms of finding the ancestors and then submitting them for temple ordinances and then ensuring that there isn't duplication? So if you go back to kind of pre-computers, this was all done by hand. So initially, by the way, members just performed the ordinances in the temple and there wasn't any duplication checking. But at some point, I don't know exactly when, somebody got smart enough to say, hey, we share common ancestors, so we should check these. And then the church started manually checking them. So there was a whole group of individuals at the church office building that basically checked for duplicates against ordinances. So you'd mail it into church headquarters and they'd mail you back. And there's lots of stories about the pedigree charts that you did back dripping with red ink from those that were checking them and telling you things that you had wrong that you needed to fix. And it created some serious demotivation for members to get involved. And over time, at that time, it was also pretty expensive. So I either had to travel to the archive to go and look at the records, or I had to write back and forth and send them money for copies. And so the church began, I'm going to say early 1900s, although I could be wrong by a decade here or there, in terms of sending out cameras into the field to be able to capture pictures of the digital images. So this vast microfilm collection that the church has now that has more than 3 billion images in it has basically been accumulated over about 100 years of sending cameras into the field and basically taking pictures of birth records, death records, marriage records, military records, wills, all kinds of different records that have been accumulated over time from a variety of countries where members have ancestors. And then as as computers came along, a part of what the team that I was a part of did was the conversion to digital. So I would say Ancestry really pioneered this, but the church got on board pretty quickly and began digitizing records. But to go back to the extraction, so the problem started to emerge in those areas that I talked about. It's organizing, it's checking for duplicates, and then
so basically members would do their genealogy, and they would trace back as many ancestors as they could.
Right.
And they would try and decide if they were members or not. And if they weren't members, then they would, submit it to church headquarters.
Yeah, initially just do them, and then later submit it to church headquarters and get it back, and then they could take that into the temple to have the work done, and then it'd get recorded in the temples and reported back, and to kind of close the loop.
So there was a time when they would just do them, bring their own names, and just do them at the temple. But then at some point the church said, hey, wait a minute, what?
We have to organize it, and so
we have to track it and make sure there aren't duplicates.
It has to be recorded, and then make sure there aren't duplicates in it. Okay. So that started off all manually, and then as computers got introduced, two things happened. Number one, less members were doing family history than were going to the temple. So they're facing a point in time where they were running out of names, potentially, to do baptisms.
Any idea around what year or decade that was?
So you're looking at probably the 1950s, 1960s, in that era, the kind of beginnings of what became called the extraction program. It wasn't called that to begin with, but it became the extraction program, started around the early 60s, and really was in full gear into the 70s, and then into the 80s, really, up until now. It's still going on now to a large degree. But and the program was this. It started off with genealogical work. For anyone who's done it, is complex. Genealogists are some of the smartest people I know. They know about history and military records and everything there is to know. But it's complex to go in and look at records and try and figure out. Sometimes they're in different languages than you. Often they're written in very hard to read handwriting. And often they're just hard to interpret and identify with the complexities of knowing that this person in a birth record is the same as this person in a marriage record, is the same as this person in a death record, is the same as this person in a military record. This is complicated, and so it takes a lot of training. And the church at some point said, members don't need to probably do all of this work. It would be better if the church just did it, given that we all have shared ancestry. And so they began a program where they basically selected individual records. So primary birth records and marriage records became the extraction program. So you do basically baptism, confirmation, initiatory, and endowment off of birth records, and then you do your sealings off of marriage records. And you could also do parent-to-child sometimes off of the birth record. If the parent was listed, you could do a parent-to-child sealing off of the birth record. And so that launched into the extraction program and started feeding the temple with names. And so for most of our lives, we didn't really think much about it. We just go to the temple and go do baptisms, and all of that stuff was just handled behind the scenes, and there were names there, and we'd do them. And the church essentially selected the kind of densest, most name-rich records, and these may or may not have been related to members. And a part of the problem with that program was while it ultimately, I suppose, might have done all ordinances, they weren't necessarily matched. So you didn't know for sure that Jane Smith over here had her sealing done to her spouse, because you're doing records very separate. You did ordinances out of order, which isn't necessarily a big deal. You often do the sealings prior to the baptism or confirmation. But the problem is they don't get organized into families. You don't necessarily know that you've completed all the ordinances, and you don't know what's missing. And so basically there was this famous talk by President Packer in kind of the early 80s, where he came in and talked to the family history department, maybe early or late 80s, somewhere in there, and basically said, "You've strayed from your ancient moorings." So it was this famous talk, the entire department together, and basically President Packer kind of saying, "You guys have screwed up, and you've strayed from the foundational principles of what is family history work."
What did he mean? What were the problems that he was concerned about?
That members' responsibility, this is a spiritual work. So members' responsibility is to identify their ancestors, and there is something both ennobling and spiritually fulfilling personally as you identify your ancestors and you take their names to the temple. And the department had turned this into a temple machine, I guess I'd call it, where extraction was feeding the names. People went and had spiritual experiences in the temple, but they were only getting half the experience because they weren't getting that wonderful feeling that you get as you perform ordinances for your ancestors. And so thus began an effort to try and reinvigorate members. And you had the four-generation program that kicked off after that, where everybody submitted their 4 generations and then were encouraged to go back further than that. The problem was getting individuals engaged, because the more and more work was done, the more and more complex this got. And then you got a whole set of computer systems that launched with Temple Ready and PAF and the International Genealogical Index, which was essentially an index of all names that had been submitted for temple ordinances, and it had temple ordinances attached. So that's kind of the history, and that kind of brings us up to present. So the church had accumulated a variety of databases. So there was Pedigree Resource File, there was Ancestral File, there was the International Genealogical Index, which is the index of all temple ordinances that have been done that had some family relationships in it, but not much. And so you had all of these disparate records, but not very organized, and you couldn't know who was the same across all of the record sets. So that kind of sets the stage for all of us kind of entering as a team to try and solve this problem and bring a solution to bear for the church to be able to simplify the process of finding ancestors and organize the work for the temples.
So there are things that have been rumored for decades. So things like, one person's name, let's just say dozens of people doing ordinance work for the same person, sure. Which means that dozens of people would be spending all those hours going through the temple to do these ordinances when it was non-efficacious. It was for no reason other than for the person to have whatever spiritual experiences they may or may not have had. But that problem of lots and lots and lots of names being reused. There are rumors that at various points in history, the church ran out of names literally. And so maybe even consciously we're having members redo names over and over again of people whose work had already been done. Then, of course, we would see from time to time, that like Hitler and Eva Braun, really controversial historical figures had their names work. And then I found out that Hitler and Eva Braun had been sealed like 10 different times to each other. So there's that as well. How much of that is folklore versus true? And can you tell us about some of the main problems that occurred before you arrived? Was any of that happening before you arrived?
Sure.
And if so, talk about that before we talk about how you fixed it.
Yeah, and while I was there.
Okay.
So both, really.
So talk about the ones that definitely happened before you arrived.
Sure. This is a long-term problem. The fact is there are individuals who have had their ordinances done hundreds, probably even some that have had their ordinances done thousands of times, because they have a lot of ancestors who are members of the church. And quite frankly, because early on, the church didn't really have restrictions about who you could submit. And so all the founding fathers were baptized at some point. I would say virtually every famous person in the United States has had their work done multiple times historically, and not so much these days, although it still does happen occasionally. And so this problem was.
Can I just jump in there?
Sure.
Can I jump in? So when I was at BYU as a student, I dated a girl named Elisa Probst, and her dad was a really faithful Mormon who had multiple sclerosis. Mm-hmm. So he was bedridden. You could barely communicate with him, but he was viewed as sort of this lion hero in the family because all he would do in his spare time with MS was extract names.
Right.
And so he would extract as many famous people as he could, and then he would get all the friends and family members that he could, and they would all go to the temple on the same day, and people would be assigned names of famous people. So I was assigned the name of Aldous Huxley, who I think wrote, A Brave New World?
I think so.
And I was just super excited to be doing work for someone who was famous. So anyway, what you're saying is this happened all across the church, and not just famous people, but also ancestors and so members for decades and decades were doing work over and over again for people whose work had been done a long time ago.
Yeah.
And in a sense, kind of wasting their time. Is that?
Yeah, I'll separate between kind of what the church was doing in extraction, in which there is very, very little duplication, like less than 0.1% of duplication in what the church does in the extraction program, because they select unique record sets, extract those, and send them in for temple ordinances, versus what members do and what we called personal extraction projects, which it sounds like your friend was doing, where individual members will go in and pull whole sets of data that they may or may not be related to, and submit that for temple ordinances. Member submission and those kind of personal extraction projects in the past had high rates of duplication, sometimes as high as 30, 40, 50%. So this notion that the church is somehow recycling names or the church is intentionally doing ordinances over and over, I think is complete nonsense. It definitely did not happen while I was there. I don't see any culture. I would actually say the opposite, that the individuals that work at FamilySearch, that work in the family history department, are absolutely dedicated to helping individuals to find their ancestors and feel a spiritual connection to this work. There's no way any of those individuals would intentionally submit duplications through the temple. That would be so counterculture, so counter doctrine. I can't imagine it ever happening. I can tell you it didn't happen when I was there, but I don't know of any time that it ever has happened. You know, has at some point a batch been submitted twice in error and ordinances gotten duplicated? Sure, because errors happen. But intentional duplication, I don't think anyone has ever had intentional duplication. The majority of the duplication has been because lots of us have common ancestors, and because sometimes members bypass the duplication systems that were there, or sometimes in the early days they just weren't very good. And so you ended up with lots of people with their ordinances done many, many times.
So just so I understand, at some point the church put together a system to try and track everything and prevent duplication.
Yeah.
But in parallel to that, members were extracting their own names. Does that mean they weren't forced to vet those with church headquarters?
Forced is a strong word. So the first probably serious outside of when you were submitting it as church headquarters was Temple Ready. And Temple Ready used the International Genealogical Index on the back end to double check duplication. But the question is, how good is the duplication checking? So if the original record was submitted with a birth date and you submitted it with a marriage date, it still would process, but it's the same person. The system just didn't know it. Or if you submitted somebody whose place of birth was slightly different, it might not flag it, or you might not think it's a duplicate, even though it really is, because the relationships weren't there. So you couldn't see how this was related to you. All you could see was a name, a date, and a place. And then you had to decide, was that the same person when it presented that? And quite honestly, the more duplication happened, the more duplication was then the more duplication there was, the more duplication happened. Because there's one of these where I submit a name in, and Temple Ready, when you used to bring it up, you'd pull it up, and sometimes you'd get a list of like 30, 40 names. And you look at the first one and say, I don't know, it might be it, might not. Well, I'll say no just to be safe. And then after you've done that 4 or 5 times, it's just like, I'm not looking at it anymore. I'll just submit it, because the worst that happens is it gets done again, but I want to make sure my ancestors got their work done. And so at some point, the duplication itself started actually causing more duplication to happen, because there were just so many records to look at that no one wanted to go through that process. And the personal record extractors in many ways were the worst, because they would often do records that the church may already be extracting. They weren't individuals that they were related to, and they were some of the worst at actually doing duplication checking, and they'd figure out ways to bypass the duplication checks and submit it. So most of the duplication is just, I would say, both honest mistakes that members were making in submitting names, all the way down to, I just want to do the name of this ancestor. I know they've been done, but I personally want to go through with them regardless of that, so I'm going to submit it anyway.
Okay. So you have a hard time imagining, some bureaucrat or general authority at the church saying, oops, we're out of names. Let's just reuse all these names and fool the members into thinking that they're doing new names when they've already been done. You're saying you have a hard time imagining that.
I don't believe it ever happened, and I can't imagine it ever happening.
But what you're saying is there was this independent, effort of members to gather their own names, but the systems that were used to try and prevent duplication had no way of really knowing for sure whether a name was duplicated or not. Plus, all the people involved had different levels of expertise or competence or whatever private motivations they had. And so it was an inadequate system that was in place, or an impossible problem to solve, that led to tens, hundreds of thousands of names and records millions being
probably tens of millions. As a matter of fact, I would say hundreds of millions of duplicates.
Hundreds of millions of people doing baptisms for the dead and endowments for the dead and sealings for the dead over and over and over again for people whose work had already been done.
Yeah, I would say there's easily more than 100 million duplicates inside of the family tree today. When I left, I think we were about...
Whose work has been done.
Oh, yeah. I would say when I left, there were about 1.2 billion individuals in the tree, and I would say the many inside of there had their ordinances done multiple times. So I might even be understating at 100 million, but I'm not overstating.
So are you saying maybe 30%? I heard you thought that number... Let me just put a stab. Are you saying that maybe 30% of all temple work has been on duplicate names?
I would say that's probably fair.
Okay, so you're saying a third of all temple work has been done on people whose work had already been performed.
Yeah, that's probably fair. It's less. It depends on where you're from. So if your ancestry is from England, or if your ancestry is from Scotland or Scandinavia, super likely that the work has already been done for all your ancestors. You'll find the odd ancestor here and there that didn't get done, but most of it's been done. If you're from Latin America, very unlikely that you're submitting any duplicates or that duplicates were done. So most of the church extraction is focused on areas with really good records. The UK in particular has been almost completely extracted and indexed. A lot of Scandinavia, some of France, but not much elsewhere. It's where there were rich records and high concentration of LDS ancestry.
So I think that's going to be staggering, because there's a lot of sacrifice. I mean, I'm imagining people, these people in Guatemala spending their years' savings to do this temple trip and to make all this to give all this time and all this effort, not to mention all the temple workers sacrificing their retirements and their good years and their bad years and whatever, all the money that's spent on these temples, for all of that effort and all that member time and leader time and tithing dollars spent, to find out that a third are just duplicates and not really efficacious. I'm kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah, hence the problem when we entered. I mean, the church recognized, I would say no one knew how large the problem was. They knew that there was duplication inside of the records. That was clear. And there had been steps taken to do it. Temple Ready was a step to try and move in that direction. The IGI was, but everyone knew there was duplication in the records. The pure seriousness of the duplication we didn't know until we started organizing them into families, and creating the family tree. And when we started to create the family tree, the level of duplication became staggering is not a bad word to use in that spot. It was so bad, as a matter of fact, that the basic design of the tree for some individuals wouldn't hold them. So we had kind of what we called individuals of unusual size. Some programmer watched too much Princess Bride, and so they called it individuals of unusual size. And these individuals had so many duplicates that the system actually couldn't load them. So we actually ran out of memory in the processor when it tried to load up these specific individuals. So we had to block access to them for a little while until we fixed the software to be able to load these. And sometimes you'd have a 30-minute load time to try and load this person up because there were so many duplicates on them. Most of these, I would say, were kind of in the early church leader or kind of the kind of most prolific early polygamists, I would say, that had lots of children and had been submitted over and over and over and over and over again. And it wasn't just temple ordinances submitted. It was the combination of pedigree resource file, ancestral file, and temple ordinances, where all of those submissions, we basically merged them into a single database and then tried to lineage link it all up. To where we said, this is how it's all related. And sometimes we could. There's still a bunch of free floaters out there in the tree that aren't connected to anyone because we don't know how to connect them, and someone hasn't connected them. Families have done huge amount of work on the family tree to organize it. But that, I would say, that was the first time when the pure nature of how much duplication had happened was clear.
Okay. So I can believe that there'd be no leader consciously, intentionally deceiving members. But I can't imagine a scenario prior to your arriving, maybe even decades before you arriving, where this problem of duplicate ordinances would have bubbled up. And I can see a leader trying to do the math in their minds. The cost and the complexity of trying to solve this problem is probably going to be very large. We definitely don't want to run out of names. So maybe I'll punt and kind of avoid solving this problem. And even though we know there's massive inefficiencies and duplicates in terms of what the members are doing, better to just keep them busy, keep the temples running, not have a big PR scandal of people finding out that a third of their work is kind of a waste of time. I can imagine that being possible.
Maybe. I have to say, most of my experience with general authorities has been good individuals who are trying to do the best they can within what they know. And so I tend to not attribute much in the nefarious space because I mostly think they're trying to do the right thing really consistently. I think the same is true of the department. I think the limitations have largely been the complexity of managing billions of records in an early computer era. And we kind of think about managing billions of records as every day now, but in the 70s and 80s, this was a much bigger problem than it is now. And so I think to a large degree, could the church have done more? Sure. Could they have been more transparent? I think in general, the church could be more transparent about a lot of things. So I think that's true. Would it have been helpful? I'm not sure. I think, there definitely was a desire to have more training. If the members had understood a little bit more the duplication problem, I think they might have been a little more careful about what was submitted. Certainly for the individuals that were submitting thousands and thousands of names that were doing personal extraction project, the department got directly involved with them to either stop them or to get them in a space where they were creating less duplication. So I don't know. It was a big problem, and I would say virtually everyone in the organization was aware of it, just not the extent of quite how bad it was.
Okay. Any other big problems that existed prior to your arriving that were really vexing the church?
Sure. We're starting to run out of temple names.
So they were running out.
Yeah, absolutely. When I got there, as a matter of fact, at one point, we were down to 2 months of inventory for female baptisms. First of all, on endowments, we will never run out. There are more baptisms done every year than there are endowment sessions
Just
done.
'cause the
There's an
baptisms-
infinite supply of right now of endowment names.
Because baptisms happen so quickly.
yeah, baptisms
it's like,
takes 20 seconds and an endowment takes
Fred Jones, I
2
baptize
hours.
you for on behalf of Jose, who's dead. Psh.
Right.
But endowments, at least in the prior endowment ceremony, before they changed it recently, would take what, an hour and a half? Or
Close to 2 hours. Maybe it's down to an hour and 10 minutes.
so-
I haven't been through since they did the changes. I hear it's shorter, but even that, it's still fairly long. I mean, it's still, even if they got it down to an hour, it's still, 100 times, 200 times more.
Also, because youth can do baptisms for the
Exactly
dead,
right.
but adults can't. So we'll never, until the millennium, we'll never catch up.
Unless you get the endowment down to 30, 40 seconds, then we'll never catch up. And I don't see
interesting.
how that could happen. So initiatory is really quick. You don't really have much of a backlog there. It gets done pretty much real time. Baptism and confirmation are very quick, but endowment is the bottleneck. And from an ordinance perspective, I feel really transactional when I say it this way. And I don't mean to be so transactional about spiritual things, but it was what we were managing. But at one point, we were down to literally 2 months of female baptism names before we were out. And we had no more names to submit. And so, to be honest, there were a few things done. One, we stepped up some of our extraction initiatives for a while until we could get members to be submitting more names. Second of all, we simply reduced the amount of names that youth could do. I don't know if you remember when this changed, but it used to be you went to the temple and you'd do 5 names. It got changed to 2. And then we actually started spacing out youth temple trips further to say they could only come to the temple once a quarter instead of once a month.
Wow.
And,
so there was a proactive effort
to reduce the
limit
amount of youth. Absolutely.
baptisms for the dead.
Because we were seriously going to run out of names. And youth would come to the temple and we'd say, sorry, we have no names to do today. And we didn't want to be in that space. So it was a serious problem. We came very close to running out of female temple names. And the reason female is the issue is because females are less dense in records. There's less females represented in records than there are males in general. And then second of all, more young women go to the temple than young men. So you both have a demand problem and a supply problem when it comes to female temple names.
Too many young girls doing baptisms for the dead for too few names, because in patriarchal societies, we don't care about our women, so we don't track them as much as we do men. Okay, it's hard to imagine that before you experienced that 2-month crisis, that the church had never run out of names before.
Well, they came close, as I understand the history, and you can. There's actually a really good book written about this if you're interested in the history. It's super dry, but it's called Hearts Turn to the Father by Kalil Mayer. It writes the whole history, and there's a lot of details in there around it's mostly where I got as I started at FamilySearch, my early history around things like adoptive sealings and things like the temple extraction program. But as I understand it, there was a time just before the early 60s when they were also in serious trouble around names, which is one of the reasons why the extraction program was kicked off. And I think after extraction got seriously going, there was, I won't say there weren't issues with inventory occasionally, but in general, there wasn't an inventory issue. The problem as we started to get into, the early 2000s is that the rich record sets we were coming to an end of rich record sets where we could be assured that there weren't duplication to be able to use. And so there was discussion of using record sets that would have higher rates of duplication. So, for instance, you can go into the census and get some records out of the U.S. Census that are really easy to extract and have great family relationships in them. But it's not a unique record set like birth records are. And so I'm not sure we ever got to that. It's possible at some point there were some submitted. I honestly don't remember out of those. So because there was some discussion of if we got desperate, we could dip into the census records for submission. I don't think we ever got to that point, but we did get pretty close.
Okay. Yeah, and so this system of individual member inefficiency that you described, that's a great safety net if you're ever concerned about running out of names. You just know that the members can keep churning and producing whatever names they have.
Yeah, and to some extent, they want to do it anyway. I mean, this is a part of where even when you have the best duplication in the world, members will submit a duplicate name just because they want to do the name for that person that they were close to. As a matter of fact, one of the problems that we got to as we started really organizing the work and showing that ordinances were completed was when grandma dies, who does her ordinance work? Because in the past, kind of everyone could just submit it.
And do it.
And even if they shouldn't,
and
even if they knew they shouldn't.
Grandma,
but also,
right?
by the way, there was a delay in terms of when it showed up in the IGI to when it was performed. So if you did it all within about 6 months, you could have like 10, 12 people do grandma, and they wouldn't even necessarily be aware that everyone had done it. But now, all of a sudden, when you went into Family Tree, you could see grandma's ordinances available, and you could do them. And then who gets to do it? And a bunch of family feelings around, well, Sally did grandma's ordinances, and that was what we agreed to, and I was the one that was supposed to do them. And all of a sudden you have this occasional conflict in families where feelings are hurt over who did your favorite ancestor's relative. It was one of the, I would say, unforeseen complexities out of Family Tree and reducing the capability of doing duplication.
Okay, so there's running out of names. Mm-hmm. There's ordinances being done repetitively. Any other big problems that
ongoing problem? You mentioned the Jewish issue. I mean, I was
Did that happen before you got there?
Yeah, it had been going on for quite a while. I'm not sure when it started, but at some point, I think there were a combination of Jewish groups who are often involved in family history. And some ex-Mormons that I would say were intent on embarrassing the church, that would highlight every single bad thing that happened. But the Jewish community in general was incredibly offended, I think reasonably, because Holocaust victims were being baptized. And from their perspective, these were individuals that died for their faith. And now the church is baptizing them. And it seemed incredibly disrespectful to their memory, to the sacrifice that they made. And they turned it into a PR campaign that was incredibly embarrassing to the church.
Yeah, and just in my experience with Mormons, not only are they not anti-Semitic, in some sense they're kind of pro-Semitic. Like, we have a love for the Jewish people because because of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, we care so much about the pure blood of Israel, and that's who they are. And so I remember in my teen years how excited Mormons were to go to the temple and get baptized for Holocaust.
Right.
We thought it was awesome.
Yeah.
It's like returning the Jews to the true faith.
And so the ordinances were, I'm going to say, invalidated, but I'll at least say hidden.
Okay, so how'd that happen? So a bunch of Jewish groups complained.
Mm-hmm. So the church agreed to discontinue doing Holocaust victims unless they were a direct ancestor of a member. And there was a special process to go through to clear Holocaust victims' names. The problem is identifying them all, ensuring that they don't get submitted, catching them before they get done, which in an era with Family Tree, again, that's a little bit easier. You can add them in the tree and then lock the record down, and then it'll show up with duplication, and you can put in triggers there to flag them. But prior to that, it was very difficult to identify them. If you had any minor variations in spelling, any minor variations in dates, it's very hard to identify. So duplication, I would say duplication on the Holocaust victim continues now. When I left, it was at a relatively low level. It was maybe 1 or 2 a quarter that were getting done. We provided a quarterly report back to one of the main Jewish organization that we're working with on the number of names that we've done. And basically they get suppressed and locked. So ordinances are, this is where I said I'm not entirely confident as to whether or not they were invalidated or whether or not they were simply removed from sight, but one of those two.
So tell us how this. So the church can make an agreement with these Jewish organizations to do their best to not allow Holocaust victims to be baptized. So they kind of make that promise. Mm-hmm. Then they would go to the IT people and say, "Do all you can to make sure this doesn't happen." So what would be the system that would prevent that from happening to the best of the...
So with Family Tree, the way it works is the Holocaust victims exist inside of the system, and they're locked. So you cannot submit them for temple ordinances. And if you add someone that matches to those, there's a system that checks it, and it'll flag it, and then we can validate it. And then if one of them is your ancestor, again, there's a special process that you can go through where you can submit them for ordinances, and then we just validate that you are actually an ancestor or a descendant of this person, and then clear that for submission.
Okay, so talk me through this because I just want to understand a little deeper. So Fred Jones is in Iowa, and he comes up with a name, okay? Is he allowed to just, in 2019, is he allowed to just go to the temple, submit the name, and do the work?
No.
He can't do that. So what does he have to do?
So what we implemented, this is kind of a part of what the change happened, what we implemented when we brought all those records together in the family tree is that is the way in which you submitted ordinances. So you didn't go to the temple, you didn't submit it through Temple Ready. You actually submit through the tree itself. And if there's already...
Is that online? Is that some... Okay, so there's...
FamilySearch.org, the family tree that's there, is an organization of all that members have submitted, and quite a lot of general public users as well. And it has ordinances attached. If you're not a member, you can't see the ordinances. If you are a member and you log in with your credentials, then you can see the ordinances that are there. This, again, was a part of the work. I would say one of the things that I probably disagreed with when I was there was this notion of what I called hiding ordinances. So we put the ordinance information in the IGI behind a member login, so you had to log in to see it. And Family Tree, you can't see ordinances unless you have member credentials.
So we were intentionally hiding the ordinances from the public and only allowing members. And we still do that today?
Absolutely. And you know,
what do you sense
why,
the logic is for that?
I think it's mostly because the church was embarrassed a lot about individuals having ordinances done that may or may not have been related to members that were famous. And I think there was a desire, because this happened over and over again, to reduce the visibility of ordinances so that chance of somebody stumbling across it was less. I will say that's my interpretation.
Yeah.
That didn't come as like, this is why we want you to do it, but that's my sense of it. And I pushed up against this a bunch because my view was I thought we should just be transparent and let people see ordinances. I don't see, the ordinances themselves are sacred. The fact that they've been done is just a part of what the church
matter.
does.
Yeah.
And so, but it's fine. It works all right. Anyway, so when these individuals are added in, the way you submit is through the tree. So, and if somebody already has their ordinances done, it won't let you resubmit them. Now, you could potentially add a new person, but then it also does a duplication check. And when I left, we were in process of doing a much tighter screen against that. So initially, it would just present it to you and say, we think this person is a duplicate. And unlike IGI, you see this person in the context of their family. So not only so this John Smith that you may have thought, well, I'm not really sure if that's it. When you see that it has the parents and children, that this person has the parents and children and spouse of the person you're about to submit, you know it's a duplicate. So initially with Family Tree, you could just say, okay, I don't care, I'm going to submit it anyway, and you could yet create another duplicate. They've been increasingly tightening that up to where if it meets a certain set of criteria, you simply can't submit it without additional approval, even if it kind of passes that threshold. There's been a lot of work to try and reduce duplication, and it's come down. When I left, duplication, I think, was sitting somewhere around 8% for member-submitted ordinances. So still high, but not nearly as high as it was, and on its way down with a goal to try and get us to under 4%. So I would suspect right now that they're probably in that under 4 or 5% range for duplication.
So if, Mormon John Smith in Iowa submits Holocaust survivor Seth Goldstein to, if he's got who he's married to and the marriage dates and the death dates and a bunch of really detailed information, right now it's going to hit up against the, what do you call it, Family Tree, and it'll be rejected.
Yeah, if they submit it anyway, by the way, if they just bypass it and say it's a duplicate, there is a database of famous people that runs against the tree every day, and there's a team that basically goes in and pulls those out and flags accounts. And if someone continues to submit, so they'll get a warning, that they can't submit them. If they continue to submit them, then their account gets suspended and they won't be allowed to submit temple ordinances anymore.
Okay. So, but some of these are still getting through. So what are the circumstances under which John Smith submits Seth Goldstein and it actually gets through?
A couple of circumstances. One, if it happens to be really fast. So right now there's some of this where if you bypass the duplication, you say this isn't a duplicate even though it is.
Who would bypass that? Who would
the
make
member. The member making that decision, it displays it to them.
So a member has
say,
the choice of deciding whether it's a duplication or not.
They do. Again, they've been steadily but surely tightening up that to allow less through. I'm not quite sure where it's at today. I haven't submitted through the system in a while.
But historically, it was up to the member to see if it was a duplicate or not.
Yes. Now, there is a back-end process for these famous individuals to catch it, but if you submitted it and then went immediately to the temple, it's possible you could get one done before it got caught by the back-end system and stopped it. And so there were a few that were still getting through on a quarterly basis.
So you could rush
a small number.
And then I imagine if you just don't happen to have a lot of information about them, and you don't quite know when they were born or who they were married to, but you want, so it's Seth Goldstein, maybe it's an IE instead of an EI, you don't have any details, you find other Seth Goldsteins, but their name's spelled slightly differently, and you're just not sure, then you're like, oh, well, this is a new record.
The system requires a certain amount of details in order to submit either family relationships or birth and death information. It's kind of gone from my head what the specific criteria are. But I think you have to have at least 2 family relationships plus at least 1 item of information about them, or you have to have like 2 items of information about it if you don't have family relationships.
Okay.
So that you can try and get a reasonable match. The reason you don't want somebody going in with just like a name and nothing else attached is twofold. One, you can't actually tell who the person is. So you don't know who it is that you've completed ordinance for. You just have a free-floating name out there. And so you can never really tell who it is, just somebody with that name. So you need either relationships or some kind of additional information to help you identify just who that person is that you performed ordinances for.
But so many of us have done baptisms for like Maria with no last name, with some date 1743, and that's a lot of us have done a lot of names like that.
Sure. So there's 2 ways that might have happened. One is, I would say there's some historical stuff out there. Today, in order for that to happen, they'd have to be being submitted with relationships. So they have relationships in the tree. And it's not that unusual. It's not that unusual to find a woman where you know the married name, but you don't know her maiden name. And you know who she was married to, and you know who her children are, so you can identify her uniquely, but you don't know the last name, and you might never find it because there might actually not be a record of her maiden name. So that's a part of the problem because a lot of genealogical records don't have the birth record will have maiden names, but often you can't find the birth record, or there aren't birth records in that culture. And so you're working from other types of records. So it's not unusual, but it could only be submitted for temple ordinances today if it had relationships attached.
But that reminds me of just this big fundamental problem, which is most of the humans that have ever existed sort of prehistory.
Sure.
So there were no records, and and everything's been burned, or there wasn't even a written language. So we're never going to get the names of those people.
Yeah, I mean, I'll call it folklore doctrine that I was raised on. Not something that I get from my time at FamilySearch, but is, during the millennium, then that'll get revealed and those people will get their ordinances done. But there's no way to find them now. They don't exist from the managing director after Jay was an interesting guy. And he used to say that, one of our fundamental rights is to exist. And a part of existing is having your identity recorded and known so it persists. And he saw this as a part of our work at the church, was helping to identify people, their relationships, their family members, so that they were remembered. And I think there's something nice about that.
Yeah. But it's also kind of, in the end, kind of impossible in
we can't do everyone. The records don't exist. And these people that think that they've traced their ancestry back to Adam, please.
Yeah, that was a big thing.
I have my Mecum side. I have it traced back. My mom was so excited to have it back to Adam. It's just nonsense. Almost everybody goes back through one ancestor in England, basically a king of England that William the Conqueror mostly, that fabricated a genealogy that he recorded in order to show that he was descended from Adam to bolster his claims as king. And everyone has used this fictional genealogy ever since to get themselves back to Adam. Records do not exist, just so everyone is clear, that bridge us back into biblical characters.
You're breaking a lot of hearts right now.
Assuming that the biblical characters are actually real, the records do not exist to connect to them.
Okay.